Well, do you want to do a bit of an intro to David while people are coming in, maybe?
Yeah, so we are, thank you for joining us. So Jason and I are the Birch Tree Centre in terms of, we're so excited to host David Hollier, who is such a expert in this space. It's really exciting to have him on board to give a talk tonight on, as he's titled it, Troubled Troublemakers. David is really well known to us. He has written pretty extensively in this area. He contributed to the book See What You Made Me Do. And Birchie was really lucky to have David and Jess Hill present a whole day workshop for all us Birch Trees last year in May, which doesn't feel, gosh, it's already been, almost a year. And we really realized that we need to be talking about working with people who maybe are perpetrators, or as David was just talking to me about, maybe we didn't know when we started working with them, but then maybe we're on our way to learning about it with the person that we're working with. So we're really excited to hear from David tonight.
All right, thank you very much, Sophie and Jace. Well, hi everyone, and welcome along to this little presentation on perpetrators. I suppose I should just say something quickly about me and how I got to do this workshop. I suppose this really came out of discussions I had initially with Sophie and a few clients that I worked with sort of via Birch Tree. And what I started to notice is that something happens to people once they think about a client as a perpetrator. And I started to notice it's very hard to sort of think of that client in the way we would normally perceive and experience a client straight away. So that set me off thinking about how to get us into that space about how we think about perpetrators, how we might work with them. And then when I started to speak to a few people working at Birch Tree, discovered that most of us don't get sort of perpetrators referred to us. Most of us are just going to be working with men who are going to show up for all different reasons. And as we know too, the more extreme version of abusive men are exceedingly unlikely to show up for therapy. No one's putting their hand up and saying, hey, I abuse people. Can you help me? This doesn't really happen. So what that meant is I've built the workshop around this experience of just working with men who may or may not be in that territory, and how would you know? And I suppose we've all had that experience if we have worked with men where we come across behavior or we start to hear a story and we feel that duty of care for another person start to enter the space. And that's what I suppose today's workshop's really interested in, is how do you work with men in such a way that if they were being drawn towards or already in abusive behavior, what would it take for us to draw them into a space where they could put that on the table, feel safe enough to put that on the table, and then once on the table, what would we do with that? How would we react? So that's sort of where the workshop's coming from. I'm going to jump right in. I suppose I want everyone to feel that if anything's a burning question, please jump in. On the other hand, we want to go through the first half pretty quick, because a lot of the stuff in the first half I'd suggest is us getting really set up. And the way I've structured it, instead of going too much into profiling or etiology or a lot of the complex rabbit holes in this territory, in those subject areas, I thought what we'd do is just go through almost like a treatment process. So before the client, meeting the client, what do you do with the client? And then how can you get to this place where we might really be able to draw them out and start to work with them around potentially abusive or actually abusive behavior that they're enacting? What do we do there? So that's sort of the structure and how it's going to be shaped. So we'll move through the first half pretty quickly and then try to sort of break it out a bit more in the second half. Hope that all is making sense. So I just want us to, start by just having a look at this picture, right? And you look at this picture, and any of these people could be clients that walk in to see you for any number of reasons. I understand that most of you that work for Birch Tree do a lot of work with trauma. That's a real focus. So we're often going to be dealing with people that have actually been on the other side of the perpetrator. And that's not to say that someone who is acting as a perpetrator, acting abusively, might not themselves have been abused. So it's a pretty tricky space, but I just want you to take a second. And when you're looking at that screen and seeing those faces, what happens when we just suddenly go from people to the idea of one of these people could be a perpetrator? So most of us, when we hear this word, it's an extremely loaded term, a perpetrator, right? So as soon as we hear it, it's pretty hard not to react to that or have a certain understanding of what that is. I noticed Sophie, I was just talking to Sophie, and even that flip comment, Sophie, that we could just, do we really have to do this? Just, I don't want to work with you. As soon as you think that they might be like that, a lot of us will have some resistance around that. We're really interested in that resistance to start with. So I was just wondering if everybody could just, I'm just going to give you, say, 30 seconds. And you can just close your eyes for 30 seconds and just say the word perpetrator to yourself and just see what comes to mind just for 30 seconds. When you say the word perpetrator, what are your associations, what images, what ideas, what beliefs come to mind? I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to experience that. Okay, I'm not sure if that's exactly 30 seconds, but I'm sure you've got the idea. So what I'm hoping you notice is that, and what we'd expect is everyone watching this right now is going to have their own very personal history of working with people, maybe victims, survivors of perpetrators, people you've known, people you've experienced directly maybe in your own lives. So just noticing that what we want to do if we're working with a male client, to be able to just ask ourselves before we even meet them, what if I did discover some abusive behavior on the part of this guy? If this guy was sort of to move from general client into that sort of territory where they may be abusive, what happens to you as their therapist? And I suppose what we want to sort of do here, I'm just going to jump ahead, is just notice that you're going to have your own, all of these things, I've just thrown a few things here, your own impressions, your own emotional responses, different experiences you've had, beliefs, various myths that are floating out about perpetrators, floating out there. And you're also going to have your own knowledge base to be working from. Even when you look the word up in the dictionary, we find perpetrator, it's unclear, right, what it actually means, in the sense that in some definitions, you'll see it's described as someone who commits an illegal act, but sometimes it might be an immoral act or a harmful act. And there's a huge difference in whether you're walking around thinking it's a criminal act or a harmful act. So there's this idea of someone who commits an offense or a crime. I think that's where it becomes clear. But most of us really need to think about what that word means and what's the difference between someone who's a perpetrator, someone who's abusive, and someone who might be struggling that we'd be comfortable working with, but when they're struggling, they might move into behavior that we think is not healthy and maybe negatively impacting other people. But would we call that abuse necessarily? So I think this is this sort of slippery territory we just want to get really clear on. I think it's why it's such a vexed area to work in, because this territory is so diffuse. So we just want to be really aware of that. And sometimes, but rarely, I think, for you guys at Birch Tree, there's that question of what do you already know about this client? Do you know that they're violent? Do you know that they've abused someone? Do you know about their partner? Do you have contact with their partner via some other arrangement? Do they have dependents, children? Have they been involved with police, court? Have they been referred, or are they doing anger management? So these are some of the areas where, you know, they might already be presenting with other information that you're having to integrate into your understanding of that client. So really all we're talking about here, it's pretty simple. I'm not sure how many of you are across that Gestalt model, but I think that's probably the most useful summary of what we're doing here. It's just that idea that those biases and expectations, understandings you have of a perpetrator or of an abusive client, that's sort of floating in the field. And if you're not clear on that and what that means to you, and if you're not going through that step of connecting with that and bracketing it, we'd expect that to really come in and start to influence that figure ground relationship that you're establishing in that therapeutic alliance with this kind of client. The other side of that term, perpetrator, where I think it is useful and can be useful, if you're working with victim survivors, to be able to summarize all that behavior down at various points. The term perpetrator is actually really powerful for a victim survivor, and for us to use it in the room with that kind of client, I think that's completely legitimate and very unproblematic and actually quite effective. But there does seem to be a bit of information out there that suggests that therapists who've worked a lot with victim survivors of abuse can bring a very narrow frame across to a male client who may show up for them as abusive. So we just want to be careful with that right up front. So the only other little study that we've got to sort of really rely on this one is in Australia. They did a study of a very well-established men's behaviour change program. They looked at 32 different dyads that were set up between facilitator and attendees and co-facilitator, and between different people in the group. What was really clear and what came out of that was that most of these guys have what we think of as a hypersensitivity to being labelled, categorised or judged. And what most of the facilitators of these groups talk about is if you exhibit any of that in the early stages, you are already coming from a long, long way behind. So what these people spoke about is being able to present yourself as really human and getting out of that frame of, say the clinical frame where they might see you in that way. They're already hypersensitive to being positioned in that way. And when it comes to, and this is what we'll talk about later, when it comes to accountability, I'd suggest that if they sense that and sort of shut down a little bit because of that, we're losing our potency in terms of being able to get to where they're really at and to hold them account if they're starting to shut down. So that secure alliance we're looking to establish up front, I think that is really important to get that client disclosure rolling. One other little thing I'll just mention going into this is this parallel framework, well, different ways that we can look at abusive behavior and addiction. And we can think that both are responses to distress intolerance. Just as someone who is in that, substance abuse model, and we'd be treating them and talking to them about that, just as we will bring them back to that moment when they experience the distress, and then from that place need the self-medication. There's a lot of parallels when we look at abusive men of them experiencing certain things in intimacy that lead them to distress intolerance, and that the abusive behavior is sort of the place they escape to. So there's this idea that both self-medicating with substances, abusive behavior can both be experiences to sort of gain control over a perceived threat, and in a sense, a technique of self-regulation. And that can sound really cold when we think of what they're actually doing to another human being, in this case, compared to a substance abuser who politely removes themselves most of the time from the people they're close to and goes off and does the damage or the behavior elsewhere. So, okay, so I just come back to me for a second. So, yeah, like I say, it's when I think about putting this together for you folks that work at Birch Tree and other people maybe, we want to notice it's extremely rare that anyone is going to sort of arrive at our door or come through our door who's already identified themselves as a perpetrator. Okay, that's just very, very rare. Some of you, I know a couple of people I've spoken to in different areas, will work through parole programs and other group or other processes like that, and have those clients referred as part of another process they're involved in. And those clients can come across, they're already identified as a perpetrator, and they're doing that. It's almost like not necessarily just a box ticking exercise, but they've been mandated to do that. So from what I understand, that if ever, but if so, very, very rarely are you going to get that kind of client arriving at Birch Tree. So I was thinking through, how do we set this up? How do we think of the client profile? And we don't want to spend too long doing profiling because this is a very vexed area. And like I say, I'm just trying to sort of tailor this stuff we're looking at today to the kinds of clients we're most likely to see, and also quite often to the kinds of abusive men that a lot of the female clients we're seeing maybe, and in gender, queer communities or LGBTQI, there's also different possibilities around this. And I suppose I should say that now, a lot of the things we'll look at do have an underlying similarity in the approach or in what's driving abuse, I think. But the way it shows up and the way that person's own etiology or psychopathology has developed, it would be specific to their different identity in that area. But most of the people we're going to see at Birch Tree, I'd suggest, are in this sort of realm I'm going to look at now. So this is not meant to cover all different profiles, but it is just a way for us to think about who we might be experiencing. Oh, where did that go? Sorry, I've just lost my little slide there. Okay, so I'm just going to run through these now. They're different sort of types of people. And in this first category, this person is not going to appear to you at all as abusive. It would not even enter your mind at first to think of this kind of person as abusive. And this is a guy who's going to show up, and this is someone who typically avoids contact, they avoid intimacy, and they're probably not going to experience a lot of direct conflict. They're extremely avoidant. These are the kinds of guys who they really fear losing control. And as a result, they often fear any emotional experience. They're quite constricted, and they're probably going to present as really isolated, quite disconnected from other people. And, if we had to pick a disorder, they're most likely to be in the depression category around that isolation. They may be substance abusing as well to self-medicate. But this is the kind of guy I suppose we want to think about. If they're at this point with so little skills around connection, the idea is if this person started to succeed with you and meet someone, what kind of contact are they going to go into if they do start to form relationships with other people? So the second category, we're looking at this kind of person, again, really avoids or becomes so quickly overwhelmed in conflict that they're going to shut down. This is the kind of person who is going to really hypo-arouse around conflict and just shut down. If it becomes tactical in an abusive way, it's much more likely to be through withdrawal or a kind of stonewalling that they might inflict on their partner. This is where we start to see this need for control. They're going to have a lot of compulsive behaviors. They're much more likely to manage their distress around conflict by overworking, substance abuse. And again, they're probably going to sort of appear through that lens of being quite disconnected, lonely, isolated. They're going to experience a lot more anxiety, and we might start to see some OCD, sort of that need for control showing up in these clients. But again, what we notice is these clients experience this condition to such an extent that they're probably not doing too well in relationships at all. The interpersonal realm is something that they don't really get to that much. So this third category, and this is where I think we start getting into the meat and potatoes of what we're doing today. This is this kind of person who's in relationships, can get into relationships, and when they're in conflict, they don't withdraw, they go in the other direction. So these are people who, once triggered, they do become abusive. That might be verbally, emotionally, potentially physically. But this is where we're getting into the first stages of coercive control. Now, I'm pretty sure all of you are pretty across what we're talking about when we talk about domestic abuse and coercive control techniques and strategies, behaviors. So I won't spend too much time in that, but we're really looking at that, subjugation, micromanagement of other behaviors, a lot of jealousy, potentially surveillance and stalking, isolating their partner, gaslighting, all those different strategies to keep the partner on eggshells and off balance. The aim sort of loosely being to sort of that perspecticide, as one theorist calls it, where the victim is sort of drawn into always thinking what the, in this case, perpetrator is doing or wants them to think. What we want to notice with these guys is, again, at this scale, they're not that aware. Or I would suggest at least there's a huge range in the levels of awareness, in the extent of their denial around what they're doing. And that's going to show up to us in their willingness or their ability to speak about what's going on around this. That's where we're making those assessments about that kind of client as to whether or not they're able to take responsibility, whether they can even see what they're doing. But what we want to notice with these guys, it's not like it's mapped out, it's not planned. Most of these guys will appear in all other areas of their life to be doing quite okay, and they'll present themselves quite often as doing okay in other areas, but they may have issues with the substance abuse or other ways that they're managing things. And that's where it can be hard for us to sort of see that they may be taking this into the relationship. So we'll have to get specific about asking these guys questions. So with the next category, they're pretty much that third category. But now we're getting a bit more into the masculinity entitlement side of things. So these are guys who aren't as concerned, and these are guys who have often come for other reasons. And what we start to notice is that they've got a real sense of entitlement. They sort of puff themselves up a lot. There's that grandiosity. And what we find with these guys is there's a really distorted perception of what they're doing and how it's being experienced. For them, they experience what they're doing as completely normal. They don't see that there's a problem at all. These are guys who often show up because there's problems in the relationship. They're often quite codependent, these kinds of men, and they hate that idea. They're afraid of that idea. That's part of the denial. But they will come to therapy if they believe that they need to demonstrate that they're okay to salvage the relationship. A lot of these guys will come in. These are guys who are often referred via couples. I get a lot of clients, and they'll be in a couple counseling relationship, and with another therapist, and that therapist will detect this kind of behavior, slightly abusive behavior or grandiosity, and they'll get a bit suspicious, and they'll suggest to this client they might go and get some work on that. So I'll get calls from couples therapists and saying, would I see an individual man? And quite often this is exactly the kind of guy that will show up at that point. These guys sort of really perceive themselves as the victims. And this is why this stuff is so tricky. We have to sort of get through this field somehow if we're going to get to where the problem actually is. These guys normally show up, and you'll hear these guys talk a lot about how they're not understood. They're quite affected by that. They're really frustrated. They don't get why no one can understand and respect them. They'll talk about respect without too much digging. They'll present as really genuinely committed often. They really want to do the work and believe they are doing the work. And they may be able to sort of recognize on some level that what they're doing is having a negative effect. But they can't really stay with that because they need to stay in this place where they're okay and where they're not perceived as in any way bad. They can't tolerate any distress about that. So I would suggest this is really our garden variety early stage abuser who, if they're supported, can really change. This is, I suppose, in a way, my ideal client, because we can definitely get through this guy. He's shown up, he's got beliefs, he needs to be perceived as a good person. and he can't believe that he's not. But when he's perceived in certain ways, that he just can't tolerate that distress, and that's where the issues start to come in. So beyond that point, I'd suggest it gets less common that these guys are showing up, and less common that we'll get straight to the issues that they're dealing with underneath. So if we think of this next category as similar to the fourth one, they really think they're pretty good, but they just cannot really self-reflect very accurately, and they can't see the impacts they're having. They're not very good at identifying feelings. But these guys really believe in their right to do this. So this is sort of the territory of, and you'll often hear these guys love Seth Rogen, they're all into Jordan Peterson. They're all going to tell you how important it is for them as men this and as men that, and they'll often talk about their partners as women. So they've really got a strong gender frame on board. And they've often got very deeply held beliefs about rights. Their right to this and their sense of entitlement is going to be really, really strong. These guys are going to be really resistant to change. They don't see that there's anything wrong with them. For them, their sense of frustration is really based on the fact that other people can't really understand what good people they are, and that the other people are just wrong. They'll tend to complain about where the world is at, and they can't believe. And this is the sort of person, if we're on board with our progressive politics and all the rest of it, these guys are going to be really, really challenging for us to deal with. I'd suggest, though, that frustration they have around that is the window in with those guys. I still think it's possible to work with these guys. Accountability is going to be more challenging. But I think because they're so interested and they need so much to be respected and they want it so bad, I think there's still a pathway in with those guys to engaging them and opening that path to exploring how it's really working for them and where they might change things and compromise and negotiate. And at that point, maybe you can get further along into what we're looking at a bit later in terms of treatment. And the last one we'll look at, just as a category, as I say, these are the guys, I would be very surprised if anyone's going to see someone like this unless they were working specifically in programs that referred a guy identified already for these behaviors across to you. These are people who've long since understood what they do and how the world works. And these guys have concealed completely this kind of behavior, and they're not going to expose themselves and their coercive control, their intent to control, abuse, harm another. They're committed to that. They see the world like that. We're in this sort of narcissistic, sociopathic, even psychopathic territory here. Just zero empathy. And these people are really very, very, very manipulative. And they're going to be, their basic contact style is just pure manipulation and control. We'd think of these as the most dangerous kinds of guys. My partner and I were talking about this before, and we're just suggesting that if you were going to take Christian Porter's plea and put it in reverse, you know, that moment when Christian Porter stares down the barrel of the camera and says, just imagine if it wasn't true. And it's funny because when you flip that over and you look at Christian Porter as the Attorney General, a man who may have gone on to become the Prime Minister, imagine if it is true. And that's what we're sort of talking about. And I think that's where we get those chills, because we know that some of these guys, this category of guys exist. And I think this category of very, very dangerous perpetrators who are committed to operating in the way that they do, a complete power over kind of approach. I think these guys really influence our understanding and our reaction when we hear the word perpetrator, because we know that at that end, these guys are so dangerous and do so much damage to anyone who comes into contact with them typically, that it's very hard for us to sort of want to make these gradations between this category and, as I'm saying, these other guys who may be much more likely to respond to treatment. So I hope that's making a bit of sense. We're just trying to sort of create this image or create this sort of profile of a client who's not at that end, but who presents for all different things, but may start to show up to you as you get to relationships and interpersonal territory as having issues around making contact and interpersonal connection, and become distressed in that area, because that's the sort of way in that we're looking for with these guys. So I suppose what I'm saying in this whole front end is, if you're really careful and you don't let yourself at any point occupy a position of judgment or distance from someone who might behave badly or even abusively, the door stays open at that point to them really establishing that kind of therapeutic alliance that will allow you later, which is where we're trying to get to today, to really hold them to account, because you've actually got a chance to see where they're really at and what they're really doing or capable of doing. So I hope that's all making sense so far. So where's my little share screen here? Let's just have a look. All right, so, and oh yeah, just a quick word here on this very vexed issue of etiology. I guess since the 60s and 70s especially, when we started to discover the prevalence of domestic abuse and violence in households, it really came out of a 1975 study, massive survey they did in the US. And it wasn't a big target of the survey to find out about violence in the home, but they threw in a few questions about that at the last minute. It's like a census they did in the States. And that's when they sort of discovered that the prevalence of violence in domestic settings is so, as they said in the report, so common that we'd have to consider this behavior normal human behavior. And at that point, when people were asked to explain that, that's when we see the beginning of this turf war between, clinical psychology and psychiatry, where there's the understanding that these men are disordered and that it's a condition, and feminism, which says, come on, you can't say that 2 to 3 out of every 5 guys has a clinical disorder. To which a lot of the psychs that have worked a lot with men were like, I think I'm okay with that. So, which is a scary idea. But I suppose we just want to be aware that there's been that argument in terms of etiology around abuse, of the extent to which it's biological, if you like, or coming out of really early childhood, or whether it's just socially conditioned and socially acceptable. And I think, the obvious answer is that it's both. So if we look at those profiles we just looked at, what we'd see is that all of those guys would share one thing, and that is an impaired or even a completely damaged to the point of ineffective ability to have any kind of interpersonal connection. So I think the interesting thing to think about is, when does biology and culture intersect? And to me, I think, the work of people like Carol Gilligan, Terence Real, looking at childhood development and what happens to boys. And there's this idea of, sometimes it's called halving, sometimes splitting. And this idea that boys somewhere between 3 and 5, as boys, get this sort of masculinity stamp, that to be a boy is to not be a girl. And it's really interesting that girls don't get that at all at that age. It's not till later that girls start to get that identification put onto them in that same way. So this puts these young boys in a conundrum, where for them to be effective little boys, they really have to have this understanding that it's not acceptable to have feminine qualities. I think Terence Real, a quote there, he talks about the masculine holds the feminine in contempt. And then at that point, once that lesson is learned, that's where we can see that entitlement settling. So we want to say there's some shame there. So there's a biological experience, but that shame is connected to this very cultural idea that you cannot reveal vulnerability, which is inevitable that you're going to experience that as a young boy. And when that's sort of presented to that young boy, there's this cultural sense of entitlement that this young boy, as he develops, he not only needs to protect himself from vulnerability, he has a right to do whatever he needs to do to not appear as vulnerable. So, this is sometimes referred to as this wound, this the everyday traumatization of our young boys is another phrase that gets used. So if we can be generous to some of these guys who end up like this and just think there is this cultural phenomena of masculinity itself, which so often is a trauma in itself. We want to think of that splitting that young boys can experience there and have imposed on them is experienced as a kind of trauma. And you guys know a lot about that. So sorry, I'll just jump to this next one. And I suppose when you look at that, and if we look at that as that cultural norm that's been around for so long, I suppose what I think about when we're working with a guy that's already been positioned like this or has had these experiences and then reacted badly and developed into very strong reactive entitlement to manage distress by doing whatever they need to do, what we're trying to do there is translate their right to avoid distress into a genuine desire to be able to tolerate that distress and maintain sort of connection with themselves and then potentially with others. So there's that idea there that, shame is the same cultural tool that gets used to inscribe that wound and the lesson. But it's also, as an experience of pain and shame, it is also the biological site of pain. And that's where that memory is of that lesson. If we think of trauma and go into that automaticity, for a lot of boys, if that develops over time and doesn't get sort of healed in some way, that lesson, that I work with guys around that implicit rule that one must at all costs avoid vulnerability. So we really want to, as a treatment goal with these guys, to sort of get them into that understanding that they're in that man trap, and we want to sort of stand beside them a bit with that and have some kind of, I suppose, empathy, but sort of sitting alongside to sort of view that coming towards them. And that's where we really want to start building that alliance from there. So now we go into contact. For time. All right, so I hope what you've got so far is that what we've really been looking at there is just all the background. I'd suggest that before you even sit down with a client, everything we've just talked through there and all those profiles and all your understandings, your experiences with perpetrators, all this mess, I would say, that's out there around this subject matter and this confusion. We've got to sort of get through all of that to even sit with these guys with a bit of an open mind and sense of real clarity around forming that therapeutic alliance. And there's just that little comparison I'd like to, ask everyone to think about there. Really, could you work with an abusive guy with the same and extend the same level of unconditional positive regard to that guy as you could to a victim survivor of abuse? And I think that's just a really interesting thing for us to sit with, that difference between the way we see those two different clients, very understandably. But I suggest that if there is a big gap there, we have to be very careful about what that's going to do to the therapeutic alliance when we very, very first start off working with these guys. Okay, so now we're going to go across and look at the therapy process itself and going into contact with these guys and what starts to happen. So these guys, like I say, they can show up for all different things. but it's going to be rare that someone's going to sit down and go straight to issues they're having in the relationship in terms of their bad behavior around conflict and potentially abusive behavior. Again, I think it's a pretty rare guy. I think it is happening more and more. We're seeing more and more guys turning up saying, I'm not behaving well at home, but they'll often connect that to alcohol. They'll put it down to relationship issues, the pressure of children or pressure at work. It's pretty unusual that a guy would just sit down right up front and identify the problems they're having as being connected to their own struggles with interpersonal connection. So I'll do the same thing I'm sure all of you do at that point. We're just going to go into whatever issue they bring up, and we're going to do whatever we can there to just establish that therapeutic alliance. Pardon me. But when it comes to this territory we're looking at today and how you get across into it and how you might work effectively with it, I suppose our first moment where we're sort of going, okay, here we go, is when we start to talk about the interpersonal. You'll have obviously picked this up in how they are with you, and you'll be watching them very carefully and how they are in terms of their interpersonal connection to you as the therapist. But we're really, really interested in bringing a very open-minded curiosity to their experiences in relationships. So just got a bunch of questions there. You'd all have your own variations of these and ask them in all different ways. But I reckon the more we can just get really curious about this, how do you go with intimacy? What's going on in your relationship? And we want to keep it in the present, what's happening now. Do you have a good relationship? Is there any tension in the relationship? Does it ever get into a real fight? If so, how do you fight? Like, what do you do? What do you say? What do you feel? And we're interested in this question: how does your partner respond? And at that point, that's when we want to really focus our lens and just watch that they can, if they can, account in any way for what their partner does and feels in that response, or if it's completely about them. And I guess if they can do that a little bit, or if they're aware they don't like it, that's when we're seeing category 3 and 4 a bit of. But if we're looking for those phrases, when she does this, a lot of accusation, and that tells us we're more in that much, much more defended, entitled space. She makes me do this, if only she'd do that. That's where we're sort of starting to get that profile or position that guy a little bit as having already adopted a lot of that entitled approach to power and control. And at that point, I would suggest they're still really open to exploring that. And our job, I'd say, there is just to keep exploring that. The more we can just be in a state of like almost pure curiosity, the more likely they're going to sort of give us more and more information in this phase of the treatment. At this point, we're really asking those questions around, are they able to see and reflect on not only the other's perspective, and not only their own, but the other's perspective. And that's where, just those questions are, how does your partner feel about that? Does she know you're here? Is this the kind of thing you would talk about with her? Are you guys able to speak about it? If so, to what extent is that to do with you? To what extent is that to do with her? And I suppose at this point, what I'm really looking for here is any evidence that this client at this point can put some of their own failings on the table. And I'm really very conscious at that point, if they can't do that, what's that telling us about the extent of their grandiosity and their sense of entitlement to not have to think through anything that they're doing. Whatever they're doing is fine as long as it brings them a sense of power and control. At this point too, we're normally discussing some pretty intense activity when we're talking about relationships fighting, couples fighting. So at that point, it's a really good opportunity to see what's the person doing around emotional contact. Is there any emotional content at all, or is it just pure cognition with a lot of defensive affect? Is there any space allowed? And if you ask them about their feelings, there's that sense, can they identify what they actually feel? And if we ask about their partner's feelings around this, do they just go immediately to descriptions of behavior? And if that's the case, again, we're getting pretty good information about their inability to sort of connect on that emotional level or on that interpersonal level around identifying feelings. And at that point, again, if they're not doing that, we're starting to notice that, wow, these people are very, very well defended, and we're sort of going to have to start shifting our strategies to a bit more of a long-term process of hanging out with those defenses. And again, we want to be careful here. This is not collusion, and there's a real issue around this. I think that people think that if we don't confront them, then we're colluding. And I think, in a way, the whole presentation today is really about that question. How can we effectively hold these men to account? And I'd suggest if we're just sitting alongside them, we're still not joining them. We're just sitting alongside and we're just watching things unfold. I really think it's possible to do that without colluding, because I think if we are too worried that we're going to collude and we move to a I'm going to hold you accountable position, at that point, it can feel like quite powerful. And I think there is a time and a place for it. But I think if we do it too early, that person is going to shut down that part of them, and they may go back to more superficial subject matters for therapy, and they'll keep that one hidden away until or unless that sense of trust gets restored. But don't underestimate the hypersensitivity of these guys to you moving to a position of, I'm going to hold you to account. And again, I'd suggest if we're hearing anything that sounds and looks a bit abusive, we want to be very, very careful as that duty of care to a person outside the room enters the frame. And if that enters the frame and we respond to that, and then speak to the client from that perspective of looking after the perceived victim of this person's behavior, we become, on the opposite side. And I think that's the defenses come right up. And if we're going to get to this place where we could actually find out what's going on or connect with them enough to really affect change, I think our chances of doing that really get damaged if we move too readily to that position. It's not to say that we don't need to do that, but I think we need to, think through really carefully what that really looks like, that holding to account, and how we get across into that territory and do that very important part of the process. But we'll get to that one a little bit later. So I'll just check where we're going. Right. So I'll just sort of stop here. I just want to check in. I'm not sure, Jace or Sophie, if any urgent questions have come up so far. We've got about 10 minutes to go before we have a break.
We're here. We're listening very intently.
It's so weird talking to a screen and not being able to stop talking.
So awful, isn't it? Everyone, you're really welcome to turn your cameras on. It's okay if you're in your pajamas. It's after 7 p.m. It's nice for the presenters to see faces, so it's lovely to see you. Why don't we throw it out is it okay to throw it out, David, to everyone?
Absolutely. That's why I just thought I'd stop now. I feel like I've been saying a lot. And we're fair.
It's been clear though, thank you.
Okay, I'm hoping it is. It is Vex territory, so excuse me if I slip around a bit, because as soon as you make a statement in this area, there's so much shadow that is around each statement that you make in this territory. So yeah, I'm welcome to anyone throwing anything in there if you've got any concerns or questions. But fine if not.
Anyone got anything so far that they wanted? Any sort of observations or questions?
I've got a comment.
Yeah.
I'm loving that you're putting into words what I've been thinking in my work. And I've been talking to my colleagues about the dangers of the caricature of the perpetrator. And I think you're talking about that. You know, if we can't see a fuller, more nuanced picture of an abusive male or potentially abusive, then we're just in a lot of trouble. There's not a lot of ways to go. And I'm really liking that your 6 kind of descriptions and sort of the nuances there and the development and the fact that there's a continuum. Because, yeah, I just find that whole, and I think it's almost like a caricature. The whole discussion is very polarized around this, and it's very difficult even to talk about that fact. I think, you know, you sort of have to be brave to say that that's what you think. But I think you're talking what I've been feeling and the struggles around working in a caricatured field is how I'm feeling. Yeah.
Great.
And everything you're saying is making so much sense. That whole sitting with for as long as it's kind of tolerable for everyone to sort of inch in and find space to, so that they just totally back off and that's the end of it, really. Yeah, that's just a little comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's glad to know it's sort of landing a bit. And I suppose with those categories, it's also nice to think about how people can move back down that scale. You know, in the same way that we're concerned when we get those sort of guys who show up and they're a bit withdrawn, a bit quiet, and they're not in a relationship. I think being aware that if we do really good work with them in that interpersonal space there and can make contact with that kind of masculinity, fear of conflict, vulnerability, we can actually give them, you know, in a way, block that pathway to, you know, becoming abusive if they do get into a relationship and they just don't have those skills. As so few guys, you know, I remember when I first started out at Lifeline and working with guys who are like high-powered corporate people who could not for the life of them identify an emotion. Yeah. And I remember at one point getting the chart that another therapist there was using for autistic clients with, you know, faces with emotion, and sitting with these men who are like 45, 60 years old, like exceedingly wealthy and powerful men with families and children, and sort of pointing at the faces and does it feel a bit like this or a bit like this and like that one? And it's like, that's anger. And just, it's amazing how they could, just been quite shocked that guys could get to that point and be so disconnected potentially from that emotion. It's quite astonishing. But I suppose what I'm curious about, if I could sort of read everyone's minds or get an answer, is for people who work with victims a lot, just what it's like when you've heard so many stories of such awful abusive behavior enacted by some of these guys, what it's like when you've extended that duty of care to the victim survivor, thinking about perpetrators in this way, you know. Yeah, and it doesn't have to be now, but if anybody had any feedback, I suppose for me doing this, I'm really curious as to what that's like, because I do both. I have a series of, you know, victim survivors that I work with, and they're sort of my 2 standard streams. And I find I like to think that working with one informs the way I work with the other, and it goes back and forward. But yeah, sometimes I have to sort of really take a deep breath if I've spent the morning seeing a few victim survivors and then I'm seeing someone in the afternoon who I think is quite abusive. It's quite a transition you have to make. So yeah, if anyone did have any feedback about that at any point, I would be interested to know how you're going with that, you know.
I can share. I've had the privilege of sharing a system with you, David, and I'll just share with everyone. And I can be a pretty fierce protector of, children, because I started my career in child and adolescent work, and so very fierce protector of children. And what I find for myself is it's great knowing that you're holding the other, and knowing that. So for me, I don't have to do both in me. But when I work well, like when I get the privilege of working with you or working with another clinician, then I know that that somebody else is holding the perpetrator in mind, and that work with the perpetrator in mind for me in this system. And that keeps the whole system healthier and more safe than if then if that's not being worked with in that way. So it might be, for me, I don't, I know where I'm good, and I can leave that work for people to partner with you or partner with other colleagues around. And to me, that bringing people in is the best way to hold that system. So instead of trying to compartmentalize and do it inside me, I'll just do it with another whole human, and you can be somebody else can be that human.
Yeah, great. And I think I'd like to think, Sophie, that, the more that gets written, the more that gets mapped out about how these guys work, even for a lot of people out there who just are quite comfortable never working with this client profile. I'd like to think, though, if we are working with victim survivors, the more we understand about how these guys work, because it can be quite confusing, I think, for victim survivors to negotiate the guys in the mid-zone who are so just complex like that, where they can be such a good person for such a reasonable amount of time, but it's almost like they've got a limit of how long they can hold that before they need to just jump into this other category or slide into that other category or get triggered into that other category. And I think so many victim survivors stay in relationships long overdue leaving. It's that very complex answer to what seems like that simple, terrible question of why does she stay? And I think having a really clear understanding of that perpetrators aren't these black and white, continuously horrific people. They're often really amazing people and often work really hard at convincing their partners that they're really up for change and they're really working and trying. And seem to make such progress that the partner feels really committed again, only to have it all fall apart. And I think the more we know about what guys are going through around that cycle, we can sort of equip, I think, those victim survivors to knowing how to manage those situations. And if it's at the more pointy end, I've worked with a number of women and had to, where they just don't seem to understand the danger they're in. And where I've had to hang on, what do you mean you're just going to leave? Does he know? And it's like, hang on a minute, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And I'm sure you're all aware of that leaving dangerous time sort of thing. But it is still amazing how unconscious some victim survivors can be, and how their optimism bias, when they're planning to leave, can still see the better part of that guy and imagine that he'd be okay with that. And that he wouldn't do X, Y, and Z, and really downplay the likelihood of X, Y, and Z. And I think understanding how these guys operate can really help us strategize with those women about what they could put in place that will minimize the chances of that guy reacting, or basically just cut off possibilities for him to act in dangerous ways and to get that separation to happen as safely as possible. Yeah, it's some tricky territory. Well, are we okay if I just do another couple of minutes just to wrap up this section? Because we're sort of just, the way it's going is we're sort of just getting all the setup in place, and then we'll have a little break. And when we come back, I just want to look at trying to get guys into the zone where I think, change can really happen. So just noticing in the last slide, we were just looking at the just that work you would do with any client, just mapping their experience around relationship in the present. So the next phase would be to that, once you've got a sense of that, then just going in and just, what's your take on it? You know, you're sitting there and you're telling me this happens and that happens. It's obviously not going that well. You're sitting here in therapy with me, and just getting them, just what's your take on what's going on? Why do you think this isn't working? What's happening? And that's when we want to open the spectrum. I'm really interested to see at that point whether the client themselves has made any connections and whether they can join the dots themselves, if you like, for me in an explanation to go back and talk about their background, or do they just come up blank? You know, so I suppose there's those, if we looked at those categories, I'd suggest category 3, they're probably going to reflect on that, like, yeah, I know I've been doing this all my life, or even as a kid, I used to sort of, you know, try really hard to please everybody, but when it didn't work, I'd just lose my shit, you know, or I'd really shut down. Category 4 is sort of like, I don't know. They're just like, yeah, I don't know why she's doing it, and I don't know what I should do. And they'll sort of tell you how they're doing everything right, and it shouldn't be happening. Category 5 is like, well, you're going to have to speak to her. You know, she's the one that doesn't seem to be able to manage things. I'm fine. So that explanation, I think, tells you a lot about which category this guy is likely to be in. And we want to notice too that category 6, who, if they are along to entertain themselves and keep themselves interested, they're likely to invent some whole thing. They're likely to be quite happy just to maybe even make up an abuse story. And there's plenty of evidence of these guys just totally taking the piss and very, very effectively convincing the therapist they were going into really difficult territory and just sort of play acting that out. And unless you're really, really watching for that congruence around, you know, the story and emotional content, and, you know, as plenty of therapists will tell you that have worked with these guys, they'll cry right in front of you. They'll produce tears. They can go to court. They can stand in front of the police with their partner, like unconscious on the floor in the next room, and weep in front of a policeman. So, but again, I don't think we're going to see that client. But it is, again, interesting just to think of that more extreme end, if you will, of committed abusive behavior. So if you get that middle client who is just a bit stumped, what we're really looking to do is just ask them, you know, so what happened? What was it like in your family? You know, when you grew up, did people fight? What was the norm in your house? Did people fight? Was there conflict? Was there anger? Was there any violence? And we're just going to go through things I'm sure you'd all be very comfortable with, do the same thing with the victim survivor when we're looking at susceptibility potentially and where it came from. Looking at that family background, looking at other relationships. So we're really just sort of mapping out the patterns that these clients have around intimacy, trying to open that territory into vulnerability and conflict. And then obviously we're looking to develop safety. Again, etiology is really, really vexed. There's so many variations, but the one that does come up again and again in terms of familial background is a shaming father or a cold, withholding mother. Both of these situations seem to sort of really exacerbate that basic double bind that we were talking about with that masculinity wound for 3 to 5-year-old boys, where emotional connection and vulnerability becomes potentially threatening. So if you've got that need to get those needs met around emotional connection, taking them to a mother who is very withholding and turns that into a power arrangement is going to really need a lot of exploration if you find that. Same goes with the shaming father. And we think of those shaming fathers as just brutal reinforcers of that basic lesson that you must never lose control. You must never be seen to be vulnerable and be continuously hypervigilant to any potential threat of distress or anything that could lead you towards anything vulnerable. So, but again, I think most of us will be doing a lot of that pretty comfortably. So let's, just before we go to the break, I suppose, just do a summary of what we're really looking at doing with treatment. And I'd suggest as we go into the next phase, being able to just have that language to talk around that masculinity ideal, and that idea that you've probably come up through that and been affected by that. And it would be almost weird as a guy if that didn't in some way affect you. And what we're trying to do here is then suggest that they've had training there that's actually biological. So, and again, we don't want to think of this as collusion, because we're holding to account, or we're giving them the opportunity and ourselves the opportunity to hold them to account, because we're sort of showing them that, okay, so it's potentially become a learned biological response for you that's very, very difficult for you to cognitively access and sort of redirect. And at that point, we're again just sitting alongside. And that's when we do that family history, just placing that in that context, almost that intergenerational entitlement that, you know, we can talk of now as, you know, the man trap, where these guys can just get trapped within themselves and they just cannot access interpersonal connection. I think one of the real things there for me, I use this a lot, I really go to disclosure around this. So I think it's really important for the guys I work with to see that I've struggled with this, and I can tell 100 stories, you know, around things that I've had to learn, bad habits that I would get into. I'll tell a story about how, for me, if I was a lot of tiredness, a lot of stress going on, I was trying to do a whole lot of things, I was trying to look after a lot of people, and then I felt like some terrible thing had happened and it's all too much, and I might sort of snap. And I'd say at that point, I might, you know, shout an expletive, and in an extreme couple of cases, like punch a door. And just telling the guys about how I had a partner who explained to me that that was really scary, and how I was really horrified that she thought she could experience me as a threatening presence, when for me, I just felt like I was incredibly vulnerable and fragile in that moment and trying to regain control. So if I can tell a story like that, it completely normalizes the idea of that struggle to manage that territory and to lack skills in that area. And obviously, being a therapist, there's that idea that, well, maybe you could, if I could learn to do it, well, maybe they can. So that can be a real lifeline to these guys, a bit of disclosure. And I've spoken to some women around what they do around disclosure, even with men's behavior change programs, and being comfortable to talk about in the room sort of very contradictory social expectations that men experience of being strong and all these things, and then on the other hand being asked to be vulnerable, and them getting a lot of mixed messages around that, and that can be very destabilizing. And it might be good to tell them to be vulnerable, but then they turn up at work and, gee, how does that go when they're around other guys and they decide to reveal a bit of fragility. So again, there's this idea that we're sitting alongside the client, but I'd suggest that as we're going through this stuff, we're really able to scrutinize what they think around gender. We're really listening. When we're giving them a bit of empathy, do they take that empathy and run with it? And suddenly it's like, yeah, fucking women this, and yeah, well, this bitch. And it's like, whoa, okay. But often you can get the other side, which is like guys just going, yeah, it's true, isn't it? And I remember as a kid, and it might lead to them starting to have connections with all these different times and really strong memories of when they took risks and were really shut down or shamed. But yeah, again, we want to just notice that empathy and connecting with, but sitting alongside, is not collusion, but is sort of opening up the territory for them to really reveal themselves and feel safe to reveal themselves. And it gives us a chance at that point to see, wow, look what comes out here or there. So that's sort of where we're at with treatment. I suppose that's the sort of territory we're trying to set up. And I'd suggest any guy you're working with is likely to have some of this stuff on board. And that could even be what we might think of as, the beta, the very non-alpha guys who have grown up having pretty horrific experiences at the hands of other men, but have long since been trying to sort of get in on that power. But given the opportunity, get to reflect on the fact that, it's not, the distress is not necessarily being caused by women. So we're getting to that more preventative approach of allowing them to understand that sort of that social biological crossover is where it's all coming from for them. So hopefully that sort of just landed all that idea around how to go in and what we're trying to set up there with that sort of alliance, and some of the things we're looking out for, and how we can put ourselves in the position to do, where's my little thing here, sorry, the next phase, which is much more around going into that moment where they, as they would say, where they snap, or what we'll think of as become very dysregulated, and then just react however. And I think that's where most of that abusive behavior is emerging out of.